Hi, and welcome to Wednesdays. With the holidays coming up, I decided to give you a couple of recipes from my book, When Ghosts Speak. No, this one is beyond delicious. This is 100 recipes from 100 ghosts and the story on how I got them. When I would start doing this years ago, I just would come into people's houses. Eventually, I started carrying a case, and for those of you who I've done work for, the seeds are in there and all kinds of stuff. And but I never carried a pencil and paper with me. Never thought it was necessary until this particular story that I'm going to tell you about. This is one of the things I picked up from my own experiences was to always take a notepad and pen with me to every job. It seems so obvious now, but back then I first started doing this in earnest, it never occurred to me. Usually the spirits were family members and I could just pass their messages or directly, or they were completely unrelated and who cared? No one really, as long as they left and they said goodbye and the house was clear and protected. Bess was a spirit who taught me to keep a notebook and a pen with me at all times. And she was also the first ghost that ever gave me a recipe. I'd never thought about lost recipes until Bess. In hindsight, I should have expected both things, the need for paper and pen and the need to pass along recipes sometimes. Times have changed. In this new age of toaster pastry, power lunches, fast food dinners, eating has become a chore and cooking is considered a hassle. Even so, most of us still define good times and good memories with food. The cookies a favorite Aunt baked, or the chicken soup you always had at Grandma's. I'm sure someone out there, some people even fondly remember the aroma of nut rolls made by a woman named Bess. Eleanor was the woman who called me about Bess. She lived alone. Her husband had been dead for years. And since then, Eleanor had become more involved with her church. That is where Bess first ran into Eleanor, at the church, when Bess was alive. Eleanor loved to bake, and her specialty was nut rolls. There was only one problem. As Bess explained to me when I got to Eleanor's house, she can't bake worth a dinner's cuss. Bess must have been 80 when she died, and she was actively trying to get Eleanor to stop baking her nut rolls. She'd blow out the pilot light on the stove. She'd steal key ingredients. She'd put the butter that Eleanor had left out to soften up back in the fridge. Anything she could think of. I couldn't fully understand it. Eleanor was actually baking the day I went out there, and the house smelled delicious. And it was right between Thanksgiving and Christmas when I was out there. And that's when most people bake their nut rolls, poppy seed rolls, and their cookies. She goes around giving those nut rolls of hers away, and everyone just throws them out. I mean, look at them. Bess offered, motioning to the cooling rack where Eleanor's signature rolls were. I turned and gave them a harder look, and Bess was right. They might smell good, but they sure didn't look good. They weren't rolled right, they were sort of flat, and they looked more pasty than golden brown. What? Eleanor wondering, seeing me turn back to her baking. What's the ghost saying? Fortunately, I do not have to talk with earthbound spirits out loud. For me, the whole conversation takes place in my head. This has saved me a lot of heartache over the years because it allows me to filter what the spirits are saying. Not that I ever make up things or put words in their mouths, but I can soften the blow when need be. Some ghosts, like people, they were mean when they were alive, they're still mean when they're dead. And some people have very little tact. Sometimes the things they say can be mean and hurtful, even if they didn't mean to say them exactly that way. So talking to them in my head gives me the chance to rephrase things and be more polite, sometimes even more diplomatic. Eleanor certainly loved the attention put in her nut roll. She just didn't have a good recipe. Her nut roll really is awful, Bess almost pleaded. How can I give you my nut roll? What I'm going to do is give you my nut roll to give to her. My nut roll is delicious. People have loved it forever. I don't know how you're going to do it, but she's got to get rid of her nut roll. So, Eleanor cut in, what's she saying about my baking? Oh, nothing much. I said, do you have a pen and paper? Because at this point I wasn't carrying around one with me. She is so thankful that you called me out here to let her go to the light that she is going to give you her very special nut roll recipe. Eleanor breathed, a secret recipe? Her eyes widening and sparkling, she got up breathlessly and fetched me something to write on with. I don't know if it's a secret, I answered truthfully, but this is the first time a ghost has ever given me a recipe. Eleanor smiled broadly, and I could see in her eyes that this was one secret recipe summed up for everything she remembered from her childhood about her family's cooks and all the secret recipes that she wished she had known then. Eleanor called a few weeks after my visit and after Bess had crossed over. She was overjoyed but also a little confused. No one had ever asked her for her nut roll recipe before, but since she started using Bess's recipe, suddenly people were calling her all the time asking for the recipe, and she didn't know if she should give it out or not because it was a secret recipe. In the end, she figured it should remain a secret recipe. So she told me she didn't really give it out to anybody, which I told her was fine. Do whatever you want. But I found out much later when she died herself, that Eleanor shared her secret recipe with almost everyone in her church parish. And now I'm passing all the secret recipes to you. I think you'll agree with me that everything in this book is beyond delicious. The other thing that I had never known before, because nut rolls is not something that I make, and I didn't, Bess, the ghost, had said to me, look how flat they are. She doesn't even know how to roll them right. And I said, there's a right roll to roll a nut roll? She said, yes. She said, have her get a large piece, like a large cloth, a large dish towel, flatten out, roll out the dough, stick it on that cloth, fill it, and then you pull up on the cloth. That will make that nut roll or poppy seed roll really, really tight. And she was 100% correct. It absolutely looked beautiful. Eleanor was happy in the last years of her life, and everybody was just real, real happy with her nut rolls. This one is for stuffing, and everybody has their own version of stuffing. I know there's so many different kinds, just from ethnic recipes and state recipes and city recipes and grandma's recipe, and so there's so many different kinds. But this is interesting. I actually tried this, but let me go start at the beginning. The male ghost in Vi's house was the one causing all the real problems. He'd managed to break the furnace twice, as well as the hot water heater, which was costing Vi and her husband money in repairs. The extra bills over the last few months were causing them to be more stressed than usual. And then the ghost was feeding on that extra energy. For most earthbound spirits, that's all they're really after, is the energy. It's how they sustain themselves, and is also why they act as a draining force. often making the living sickly and anxious. This ghost was doing it partly for that reason, to heighten the energy for him to use, but also because he was just an ornery cuss. He was even more ornery to me when I got to Vi's house. He refused to give me his name or any information about why he was there or how he died. Based on his description and behavior, Vi's husband later pieced together that it had been a guy he knew from work who had died recently, a guy that he had never gotten along with, and who obviously still held a grudge after he died. Fortunately, he was easy to get rid of. When I made the white light, he went into it almost without me asking him to leave. The other, smaller problem was Vi had noticed, like flickering lights, the TV turning off for no reason, and a general sense of unease. This could have easily been caused by the man who had left, but the woman who was also there undoubtedly caused some of it too. She was an older woman, and she looked prim and proper, much like the stereotype old maid. With a high-collared blouse, she was even wearing a cameo pin. Vi yelled, "Grandma Pet!" And the woman smiled and nodded, but I was a bit confused by the name Pet. I asked, "Is that a nickname?" "Sort of," Vi said. "All the girls in the family are named after flowers. I'm Violet, but they call me Vi. My sister is Daisy, and Grandma was Petunia, so we called her Grandma Pet." Grandma Pet had died years before, and she turned out to be a bit difficult to deal with. Not in getting her to cross over. For most earthbound spirits, that's pretty easy because they've been stuck here a long time and they're really ready to move on. But in getting her to tell Vi the answer to one question she wanted answered above all others: what did Grandma Pet do to her stuffing that made it so good? Grandma Pet just smirked at me when Vi asked, so I prodded her. She just shook her head. "Nope, she has the recipe. She knows how to make it." We all have recipes. "We all have the recipes," Vi cried when I told her what Grandma Pet said, "but it never tastes as good as hers did. Every Thanksgiving and every Christmas, it's always the same. We spend all dinner talking about how much we miss Grandma Pet's stuffing." "Could you get the recipe you have and read it back to her?" I asked Vi. "Maybe something was left out when you copied it down." Vi did as I asked, and Grandma Pet just smirked, that same smirk, the whole time she was reading it. When she was done, Grandma Pet said, "She copied it right. There's nothing missing." "And the proportions are right?" I checked with her. "It's the right recipe," she said again. But I could tell just by the way she was smirking about how there was something she was leaving out. So I started letting her know the annoyance that I was feeling at the time. "At least," I said, "how could you do that to her? I can tell you, leaving something out, is it really that important that your recipe stays so secret?" "Well, at least they always talk about me," she replied. "At least they haven't forgotten me." "Forgotten you?" I asked in disbelief. "Is that how you want to be remembered? As the grandma who deliberately gave them the wrong recipe for her beloved stuffing? As the grandmother who refused to give up the secret, even her very last moment to tell it, she just held her tongue." I said, "Wouldn't you rather be remembered for giving them a good recipe instead of giving them the wrong recipe on purpose?" That got the wheels turning in her head. Her smirk faltered, and she scuffed her feet a bit, thinking on what I had said. Finally, she raised her head, stood straight, and said, "It's the eggs." And that didn't mean any. I mean, I am a person that actually does put eggs in her stuffing. I know there are a lot of people that do not put eggs in their stuffing, but our family always did. And I said, the eggs? And she said, yes, tell Vi to get ready to write this down. So I got up my pad and my pen and I wrote it down also. You have to separate the eggs. The yolks have to be creamed and then mixed with the other ingredients. But the egg whites have to be beaten separately until they're stiff, then folded into the stuffing after everything else is mixed together. I said, that's it? She said, yes, that's it. I thought, how could something be that simple change a recipe so much? But then I'm not, it has to be chemistry. That's what I figured. It must be chemistry. You must change something by puffing up the egg whites. Later, I tried it myself. I couldn't believe that something as simple as separating the eggs would make that much of a difference. To test it, I used my own stuffing recipe so I could judge the difference, if there was one. I was quite amazed to discover that indeed it does make a huge difference. My stuffing never tasted as good when I didn't separate the eggs. And Grandma Pet was right. It absolutely made a huge difference. So if any of you, when you're stuffing your bird these holidays, before you put your eggs in, if you do use eggs, separate them, put the yolks in, mix them up with everything else, beat up the egg whites. As soon as they're stiff, fold them in, stuff the bird, put it in the pan, whatever you do, and you will be amazed at how good the stuffing actually is. So this is why, because of the holidays, this is why I took the stuff out of the book, Beyond Delicious, and maybe just something different to try this year. Next week, it'll be a few more dessert recipes before the holidays. Thanks, and talk to you next Wednesday.